Hello, everyone. Welcome to Democracy in 5 Minutes. As ever, I'm your host, Paul Manna. I'm a professor of government and public policy at William & Mary here in Williamsburg, Virginia. I know it's been a while since our last episode, so I'm really happy to be back with you. Today, I'll discuss the role of protest in democracies. Clearly, this is a highly salient issue right now out there in the country. Across the nation, for example, thousands of people have protested actions of ICE, the Federal Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, as it has surged into cities to implement President Trump's immigration policy agenda. This has prompted several protests, as I'm sure you know. So with those events in mind, I'd like to answer two questions today about protest. First, where does protest fit into the American democratic tradition? And second, what does the evidence say about whether protest works to achieve its objectives? Let's dive into that opening question. So where would we place protest in the American democratic tradition? The short answer is we would place it right at the center, actually. Protest really has a long history in American politics, dating back to the Revolutionary period. In that era, for example, people protested in many ways, including marching, publishing opinion pieces in newspapers, and also printing their own pamphlets to resist the King of England's attempts to assert his authority on the colonies. These protests gained intensity as the king passed laws and deployed British redcoats to tighten his grip. That tradition of Revolutionary era protest helped motivate the authors of the U.S. Constitution to include several provisions in the nation's founding document to protect the rights of protesters. The First Amendment to the Constitution states in part that, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. All of those things in the First Amendment support the kinds of tactics that protest movements commonly use. Speaking out, publishing criticisms of the government in the news media, assembling to discuss ideas and to plan protest actions, and finally petitioning the government through actual written petitions or letters, for example, or through words that people literally say to government officials directly. These are all parts of the rights that the First Amendment guarantees and that support a right to protest. Importantly, the First Amendment does not give protesters the right to destroy property, to physically harm people, or to break other laws in the course of a protest. Protesters do go out of bounds when they do these things. Since the Revolutionary era, Americans have mobilized these rights to advance all sorts of causes. Notably, the nation's history includes thousands of protests from the civil rights movement of the 1930s through the 1960s, a period that I think is fitting to note here given that I'm recording this discussion during Black History Month. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, emphasized in a 1967 speech that, quote, every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we must all protest. One could ask, though, does protest work? That's our second question for today. Can protesting lead governments to change policies? Does it motivate segments of the population to support the protesters' causes? These are important questions. And fortunately, there's evidence on this topic that protesters can consider. Fascinating research from political scientist Omar Wasow, who has studied protests from the civil rights area, does provide valuable insights on this question. Wasow argues that protests can help set media and government policy agendas by capturing attention of the public and government officials. In other words, protesters can get what they want when they use protest and exercise their First Amendment rights. But not all protests produce these results. The tactics that protesters choose to use matter a lot. Wasow finds that protesters are likely to be most successful when they mobilize nonviolent protest actions. Nonviolent protest has even stronger effects when government officials respond to it with violence of their own. This occurs, Wasow argues, because media coverage of protesters and their causes becomes more favorable when nonviolent protest prompts violent government action. That has noticeable effects on public opinion, on voters, and elected representatives. In contrast, protests are likely to backfire and turn people off when they become violent, as in destroying property or aggressively attacking government agents. When this happens, the media portrays protesters in ways that suggest a law and order response is appropriate and even necessary, a cracking down on the protesters. Voters and other people lose sympathy for the protesters and their cause, and lawmakers become more likely to advocate for policies or actions to punish protesters and the organizations that support them. As a practical matter, then, what do these findings mean for you if you're considering organizing or participating in a protest? Two things I'd say. First, use protest strategies and tactics that are consistent with your First Amendment rights and do not slide over into unprotected violent activities. Not only is that important so you can be acting lawfully, it will also help build momentum for your cause. Second, be sure to work with your fellow protesters to learn about and to practice carrying out nonviolent protests. As students and scholars of the civil rights movement understand, that attention to detail is so important. Leaders of the civil rights era actually trained hundreds of thousands of people across the country to protest so that they themselves were not using violence as a tactic. That helped keep narratives about their movement focused on the civil rights cause and the need for change. I would really encourage you to consider taking the time to do the same thing. Develop plans for what your protest actions will look like, actually practice your marches and your behaviors on small scales in training sessions. I know that in today's digital age, that can seem painstakingly slow, but if the goal is to get good results, then it will be time well spent. That's where we'll wrap up today, folks. As usual, thanks for joining me. I hope you found these ideas interesting and helpful. We'll explore some new issues in our next episode. And so until then, take good care. I'll see you soon.